Beginning of session 1, and in this session we'll be talking about extroversion and introversion. Okay. Now, extroversion and introversion in relationship to what? That's our first question. Well, we're talking about Jungian personality types. Now, Carl Jung is a Swiss psychologist, a disciple of Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud was the father of psychoanalysis, people are familiar with, and he developed the idea of the id ego and superego. And Freud thought a lot of what happens to our lives is directed by what our initial development as children, our sexual orientation, what happened to us with our parents and so forth. But the problem was, at the time Freud lived, Freud was Jewish. And the anti-Semitism that was rampant in the late 1800s made it difficult for Freud and the other psychoanalysts, who also tended to be Jewish, to communicate with the outer world of Christians around them. Carl Jung was a Christian, and he was a psychiatrist, and he was interested in what Freud was interested in. And Freud felt that maybe through Jung he could communicate with the Christian world. His ideas were more acceptable. Well, this worked out for a while, but then Jung and Freud got into a lot of fights. At first it was that Jung thought that sex wasn't as important as Freud thought it was. Then they got to arguing about dreams, and Jung thought dreams were more important than Freud thought they were. After a while, they weren't talking to each other at all. Jung got to thinking, what's really the problem here? It's not that Freud's right, or that I'm wrong, or that I'm right, and that Freud's wrong. Maybe it's more a matter of how we look at the world and how we make decisions. Maybe neither one of us is right, maybe neither one of us is wrong. With this idea in mind, Jung began a study among his clients to see if he could discern what the individual differences were in the people that came to see him for help. Then he got interested in Eastern philosophy, and he studied Eastern mysticism for a while. Got really interested, deeper interest in dreams. Finally, about 1925, he wrote a book, Psychological Types, which took into account all the studies of differences in people since the dawn of time. The Greeks talked about different humors that were in people, melancholy people, for instance, and so forth. And all through the Middle Ages, there were different points of view about practical people, imaginative people, outgoing people, inner-directed people. Freud takes in all of this human experience since the very dawn of recorded history, rather Jung does, and tries to develop it into a coherent theory of personality types. And that's what we're learning about tonight, is Jung's theory. Now, Jung based his theory on the theory of normality, which means that nobody is sick, that perfectly normal, functioning people differ in perfectly normal ways. So we're not talking about the psychology of abnormality. That's a different seminar. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with perfectly normal differences. And no matter how you see yourselves on these differences, it really doesn't say anything negative. It's just that the world needs all different types. All different types contribute to the world in many meaningful ways. Long about the same time that Jung is writing this book, Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs come into the picture. Isabel, Catherine's daughter, is engaged to be married to a boy who is totally different from her in seemingly every way. Catherine, wanting to give her daughter a meaningful present, decides to give her an understanding of human nature, that would be the best gift. So in advance of the wedding, she began reading biographies of different famous people, and from these biographies trying to put together some sort of a picture of what people were like. And she had humorous people, sad people, melancholy people, so forth. Then she read Jung's book in the 1920s, and she said, this is the answer, I found it. This is what I've been looking for. She contacted Jung, became his disciple. So did Isabel. And the two women began to study Jungian personality types, something that they would continue to do for the next 50 or 60 years. How did they study it? In the neighborhood. They would figure out what types the neighbors were likely to be, or the children, and they would watch them. They'd hold parties in their house and talk to people about their type preferences. Help them understand their type preferences in terms of the disagreements they had, in terms of the differences between themselves and their children, and how their children learn, and what their children are interested in being. The American Medical Association got very interested in what they were doing, and they began funding their research along about 1940 or so. And they began giving Isabel and Catherine developed what's called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator in 1943. And the indicator began to be given to all incoming medical students. And they followed these medical students for over 20 years to see what specialties they would go into and see if their type preferences affected their performance in medical school and what sort of doctors they eventually became in terms of their specialties. This is a little background on what we're going to be talking about in personality types. Now, Jung felt that we're all born with these types. They're inherited. We had no choice. Just like certain insects know the mating dance without being taught, or know the honey dance like the bumblebee without being taught. Just like certain birds can build a nest and have never been taught how. This same genetic way, we as human beings inherit genetically certain predispositions to go one direction or the other on each of these four basic preferences that Carl Jung talked about and that Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs developed in the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Now, not everybody believes that human behavior is genetically induced. Some people think it's purely environment, and that's what's called the nature versus nurture controversy. Are we like we are because we were born that way, or are we like we are because this is how we were taught to be? Or is it a combination of both? Probably more a combination of both. But from the Jungian perspective, he would put more emphasis on the genetic determinants of behavior. And there was a recent television program on TV, Phil Donahue's show, on the human condition. And they talked there about a certain enzyme that was in people who were risk takers as opposed to a lower level of the enzyme in people who weren't risk takers. And they seem to scientifically be establishing some sort of support for Jung's theory that maybe biochemically we have strong inducement to behave certain ways and to meet the world in certain ways. Now, one last thing before we talk about extrovert and introvert that I always like to mention is how people take this information. When I first heard about the Myers-Briggs, I was really excited about it because I've always been looking for an answer to why people are like they are. And I never could seem to find it. And it always confused me. Then I was introduced to the Myers-Briggs and I got really excited about it. I said, this is it. This is the answer. And I studied it night and day. It became almost like a religion for me. I found after a while, though, that it didn't answer every question. The personality type theory doesn't tell us why some people are criminals and other people are not, or why people fall in love, or any of these things that we seemingly have no answers for. What it does give us an insight into is why we act like we do, why we choose the friends we choose, why we marry the people we do, why we find ourselves attracted to the kinds of jobs that we seem to be attracted to. It does seem to give us an insight into some of those questions, not necessarily the moral questions. Now, I was excited about it. There are other people who hear information like this and they think it's a bunch of garbage, you know. They say, I'm all the types, I'm everything. Or, no paper and pencil test can tell me who I really am. And they get all kinds of reasons to reject psychological information like this. Well, that's probably not a good idea either, any more than going overboard in one's enthusiasm, because if you reject the whole thing, you can lose a lot of good and useful information. So what I suggest to people is, why not sort of look at it in the middle and say, well, I'm going to listen to this with an open mind and take what I can from it. If it makes sense, fine. If not, then that's fine too. You know, at least I've heard something new. I've learned a little something new. And that's what we're going to try to do today. Okay? All types are good, which we mentioned, and all types contribute in a unique and special way to the work of the world. The main emphasis on the idea that differences can be good. They do not have to be bad. On this sheet, I've given you a description of the four basic preferences: introversion and extroversion, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and judging and perception. Now, we're going to have a series of 4 separate meetings. This first meeting tonight is going to focus on extroversion and introversion. The next session will deal with sensing and intuition. Then we'll have thinking and feeling, then judging and perception. After that, we make combinations. We talk about the person who's extrovert and intuitive, or introvert and intuitive, or extrovert and sensing, or introvert and sensing. We put the combinations together, profiles together. We talk about how different types of people relate to time, how they relate to relationships, how they react to crisis, and how the type differences develop over the course of a person's life. And that's what we'll be doing in these seminars. But first tonight we talk about extrovert and introvert. Extroversion and introversion are two ways of meeting the world. Now the extrovert likes to go out into the world of people and things. They tend to be very good at small talk. They're very concerned about how they dress and their appearance because they want to make a good impression on other people. They're very strongly influenced by what other people are thinking. The energy of the extrovert just seems to radiate out from them into the world of people and things. Extroverts like to have big houses, fancy cars, things that impress the world. Extroverts are great at parties. They tend to have a lot of friends and a lot of acquaintances. They tend to have a large number of interests. Good at small talk, as I mentioned. They tend to make and break friendships as easily as changing their clothes. All of these are skills to the extroverted person, the one who directs their life, meets the world in the outer world area. On the other hand, we introverts, and I'm an introvert, and that's important for you to know, because as I describe these type differences, and I hear other people do, we tend to make our own type sound a little better than the other type. That's because we're more familiar with our own type. It's natural. And the examples I use and the feelings I try to express are true for me. It's more difficult for me to talk about extroversion. I've never really known what it's like to be an extrovert. So if I make introverts sound more interesting, it's just not because I'm down on extroverts. It's because introvert is more natural for me. I'll try to balance it, but I have to ask you to understand that and make allowances for that. And notice how you might do that in your own lives. Okay? We introverts build a world within ourselves where we prefer to be. Our life energy is directed inward. We're not as good at small talk. We tend to have fewer friends, but deeper friendships. We're not as concerned with how we appear to the outer world. The outer world is of very little concern to us, unless something happens that we have to deal with in the outer world. We tend to have fewer interests, but deeper interests. Now, I'm going to try to describe the typical extrovert and the typical introvert. And for most intents and purposes, they're going to be stereotypes. Most of us fall in between one of the shades of gray area, so we're kind of like one, but we have a lot of the indications of the other. It's like this. If I took two lights and put them on everyone's head in this room, one light was for extrovert, one light was for introvert, they'd be going on and off all night. And they go on and off all day, and they go on and off even while we're asleep. Now, if you're an extrovert, what that means is the extrovert light is on more often. And if you're an introvert, what that means is the introvert light is on more often. The one that we do more often is the one we become more skilled at. We become better at that. We rely on it more. We trust it more. And that's what makes it our choice. So rather than say someone's an extrovert and an introvert, a better way to put it might be to say that someone prefers extrovert or someone prefers introvert as a way of meeting the world. Okay? Now, an example of someone who had almost 100% extrovert light going on would be a gal I taught at St. Petersburg Junior College in the mid-60s. Her name was Mary Ann. She was on the debate team. And on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which you all have an opportunity to take, the Mary Ann came out 100% extrovert, no introvert choices at all. And I decided to do an experiment on her, to see if this theory really works. And what I did was I put her in my office with a stack of books to read to get her speech ready. And I bought her a Coke and put the Coke on the desk, a pencil. And I asked her to work in my office alone for an hour to get her speech ready. But she was very resistant to this idea. She asked me if she could take it home, if she could do it later. And I asked her, no, you can't do that. Do it for me, do it for the team. I want you to work alone on this material for an hour. Finally, she agreed. And I went out, closed the door, walked to the end of the hall, and waited. A few minutes later, the door opens, and she sticks her head out and looks both ways, doesn't see me, walks over to the doorway of the Humanities building, and within a few minutes, she's in an animated conversation with two guys that were standing there, one of which she makes a date with for the weekend, notwithstanding the fact that she was going steady with the guy in the Royal Canadian Air Force at the time. Okay? Now, I come walking up to her and say, Mary Ann, are you finished? And she said, I'm just taking a break. And she introduces me to her friends. I go back to the office, and nothing has been touched except for the Coke. That's gone. But the pencil hasn't been moved. The books, note cards, and so forth are all there. The next day, I put her around the table with everyone else on the team, the same assignment. Well, now she's working happily along. She's opening pages, she's making notes, and she's talking to everybody else in the room at the same time. The team nickname for her was Motor Mouth, because she seemed to always be talking. Her productivity is up 100% when she's allowed to work in an extroverted environment. Now the question for Marianne is, what happens if she should have to study alone? What happens when she gets married, becomes pregnant, for instance, and because of some condition that might develop, she has to spend time alone in her room? Or she goes to graduate school and finds that she has to spend time alone in a study carrel. Will it be easy for her to do with that strong an extrovert choice? Probably not, you see, because Marianne's extroversion is her preferred side. Her introversion, Jung calls the shadow side of her, the place she doesn't like to be, the place that she avoids. So whenever Marianne has to go there, she feels lonely, she feels cold, she gets chills up and down her body. It's depressing to be alone because she is comfortable with and used to extroversion. Now, as you might see from this example, it's not good for a person to be so one-sided because they lose whatever benefit their shadow side might provide. Jung says that we should be excellent at what we prefer, but use our shadow enough so we can use it when we need it. My suggestion to Marianne was that she get a big book, something like War and Peace or some real giant, formidable book, and put it by her bedside. And every night at the same time, maybe 9:30, 9:45, whenever, open that book up and read it, and put a bookmark in and stop. The first week, read it for 15 minutes. The second week, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, until she's finally worked herself up to spending at least 1 hour every night in her introverted side. If she does that, forces herself to do it because she won't like to do it when she first starts, but if she kind of makes herself do it over a period of time, she'll notice that her life seems to level out a little bit more, that she has more use of her introversion when she needs it during the regular day. So it's something we sort of build up a tolerance for, just like as if you were getting an inoculation. You give a little bit of the germ and a little bit more to build up a person's resistance to that or comfort with that part of themselves. Now, on the other hand, we have the introvert. Now, how does that work? Well, I know that one a little bit better because I grew up as an introvert. I remember in 10th grade sitting in the back of the room. I would never sit in front of the room. The idea of giving a speech was a frightening thought. When they called the roll, I could hear my heart pounding and pound faster as it would get toward the ends. And I just know that when they called my name, I was going to do something embarrassing. My voice would squeak, or I'd say the wrong thing. Some people would say here, some say present, some say yo. I knew whatever I said, it would be the wrong thing, and everyone would laugh at me. I was convinced of that. So it was a grueling experience just to answer the roll call, something that other students seemed to have an easier time with. Now, we know in society generally that there's 3 extroverts for every introvert. So we introverts are sort of a minority group, and we suffer as a result of being a minority group. People accuse us of being quiet, wallflowers, inhibited. And introversion is looked at as something negative. And it was when I went to school. I didn't have many. I had very few friends, if any, and they were usually people I knew for a long time. We introverts have fewer friends but deeper friendships. It takes us so long before we finally get to accept someone as a friend that it seems like it takes us an equally long time to end the friendship, even when that person's hurting us. Even when they're double-crossing us, stabbing us in the back, we will still try to preserve that friendship because we have an investment in it. We don't make friends easily. And as an attorney, I could see this in my office, the difference between the extroverted client who bombs into the office, their rear end hovers about 3 inches above the chair while they're asking me how quick can they get the divorce because they got Harry waiting in the car, to the introvert client who sinks into the chair and wants to go over everything that happened in the whole relationship, find out where it went wrong so we can fix it. And they want me to tell them that if you use a number 5 wrench and turn 3 turns to the left and 4 turns to the right, that somehow it's going to be better. And that's what I like to tell. That's what's important for introverts to hear about this, is that that's a mind trick we do on ourselves. There is a time when you just have to say enough is enough, and you have to end the relationship. Now, we're reluctant to do it because we don't know what we're going to get, and the hell we got. We know, but we don't know what the hell is that we're going to get if we go off to try to change the relationship. And also, we it took us so long to get to trust this person that we can't believe that we can't fix it. We introverts sort of hide inside our shell, and we look out at the world, and the world is something to be manipulated and something to be fixed, something to be made comfortable so that we can come out and live in it. And we're constantly trying to fix that outer world, to repair it, to make it right so that it's good for us to live in. And there are times that you just can't do that. You just have to accept the world as it is and make the changes that you need to make, and realize that as introverts we play this mind game on ourselves. We fight against what's best for us sometimes. And that's what I was doing, until a friend of mine suggested that I join the debate team, which I thought was a totally incredible idea. But he said I was an intelligent guy and I would do well. And I said, "Are you kidding? I can't answer the role. How do you expect me to do debates?" He says, "Well, why don't you just go watch the team practice?" And I did. And it seemed interesting. They all had all their books ready and their evidence, and they could present the materials. And I thought to myself, I could prepare that whole thing in advance, and I was good at that. Because we introverts are good at reading and thinking. And maybe if given enough time to prepare, I could get away with giving a speech. So it was an intriguing idea, but not one which I immediately went for. I just sort of put it in the back of my mind. Well, the next year, I was in the 11th grade, and I noticed, I was in a dentist's office one day, and there was a Look or Life magazine article about John Kennedy's campaign for the presidency. And when I opened the article up to look at it, it had Ku Klux Klan people burning crosses, and the article was about it. People were saying that a vote for Kennedy is a vote for the Pope, and this sort of thing. And that got me angry. I said, this is wrong. And coming from a Jewish background, I realized that they could discriminate against Kennedy, they could discriminate against me. Now, I didn't want to be president, but by God, if I did, I wouldn't want my religion to stop me. So I decided that I would do something to get John Kennedy elected. That would become my mission. Now, in order to accomplish that mission, I had to give public speeches. There was no way out. I mean, that's politics. So I joined the Young Democrats Club, and they sent me down to Miami Beach. We lived in Miami Beach at the time. Down to South Miami Beach, where they had the Blackstone Hotel and all the retirement homes. And people would sit on their porch and rock, and I would talk to them about Social Security. And whenever I'd say, "Raise Social Security," they'd all cheer. Now, this is very good. Those people will watch anything that stands in front of them and moves, and they'll cheer anything that says, "Raise Social Security." And I got a little support for that, the idea that maybe people would like what I had to say. Then I took the big risk in 12th grade. I took a speech class for the first time. And it was a real big burden. Many introverts tell me they sign up for speech and drop the class. Some sign up, make their first speech and drop. Some sign up several times and never quite get through their first speech. It's a real challenge for an introvert to take a speech class, to expose themselves before a group in terms of talking and letting people look them over and so forth. So I was going to take my chance. I was going to do it. Well, Miami Beach High School was a very rich school in those days. It was before the Muriel boat lift, and the economic picture of Miami began to change. But at that time, it was a very wealthy community. And they were on their way to a tournament at Houston Bel Air in Texas. And everyone was trying out for different events so they could be on the bus and go to this tournament around Christmas time, 1960. I tried out for an event called an analysis of public address. What I would do is analyze President Kennedy's speech then Senator Kennedy's speech to the Houston Ministerial Association. Now, the Protestant ministers in Houston had been preaching in their pulpits that a vote for Kennedy was a vote for the Pope, and saying that their Baptist congregation should vote for Nixon. Kennedy knew that if he had any chance of winning the election, he had to stop that. Because Lyndon Johnson notwithstanding, he couldn't fight all the Baptist ministers in Texas. So he went to their convention, gave a speech on liberty and democracy and tolerance and so forth. It was very well received. My plan was to analyze that speech, go to Texas, and convince those Texans that they should vote for a person because of the person's qualifications and not reject him because of his religion. I worked for days and nights on that speech until I finally got it worked out. And then I came up in front of the speech class to deliver it. And when I started out, the teacher was sitting in the back of the room, she'd say, "I can't hear you, Frank." And so I'd have to talk louder. And she'd say, "I still can't hear you, Frank." And so I'd have to talk louder until I almost thought I was yelling before she said she could finally hear me. And I learned that we introverts have a very low voice. And I've noticed in my speech students that sometimes it seems like it's coming from up here, and sometimes from down here in the throat, and sometimes from the back of the head. but very rarely from the diaphragm. Very rarely does it boom out like a voice should. Then she said to me, "Frank, you're not looking at us." And I said, "Well, how can I read my speech and look at you?" Because we introverts like to read our speech. It gives us some place to hide. And she said, "That's your problem. Students, raise your hands if Frank isn't looking at you." So now I had to find a way to read the speech and look at everybody in the room to get their hands down. It was humiliating, but I had to do it if I wanted to go on this trip and make this campaign speech. Then I had to learn how to stand up straight. Then I had to learn hand gestures, vocal modulation, so my voice would sound interesting. And then they tell me I had a deadpan expression, like I always kind of talk like this with no expression at all, and I had to have some expression. "Well, what do you want me to do?" And they say, "Well, why don't you do this, sort of crease your eyebrows, back and forth like this, and it'll look like you have facial expression, the appearance of facial expression." And I had a lot of trouble with that, and I practiced at home, looking in a mirror, smiling, being angry, doing all kinds of faces, until I could get comfortable with myself having facial expression. But it's something I had to learn. Was I becoming an extrovert? No. I still remained an introvert. I was learning how to use my shadow side. I was an introvert learning how to extrovert. Okay? The bus leaves. We're on our way to Texas. Everybody else is having a good time. I'm rewriting my speech. We introverts are very serious people. We're typically not good time people. From the introverts come the philosophy, the poetry, the deep ideas, and so forth, rather than the parties, the good times, and the glad handing, and so forth. So while this gal sitting in back of me is blowing in my ear, I'm pushing her away, trying to rewrite my speech, because it's so important that I do this thing. It was beyond anything that I would do for myself. I get to Texas. The first round, it was during the regular school day, and it was a wooden portable full of students. They were in all the seats, plus in the windows. It was really packed. There were 6 people in the round. You had to be in the top 3 to go on to the next round. Okay? I start out my speech and went something like this. "I solemnly swear to faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So help me God." What God? God of Catholics? God of Protestants? God of Muslims? God of Jews? Does it matter through which medium the next President of the United States reaches God? It didn't matter to Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie at the Alamo. It didn't matter to the heroes of American independence, and it darn well shouldn't matter to us. And everybody jumped up, and there were rebel yells and screams. It was fantastic. Number 1, for 3 rounds running, the thing was so popular that as each round went on, they put me in a bigger room because there were bigger crowds. Teachers were combining their classes to hear the speech. It was incredible. Now, after the 3rd or 4th round, they posted the semifinalists, and I noticed my name was on the list. Now, it never occurred to me that I'd be a semifinalist. I wasn't there to win a speech tournament. I was there to get Kennedy elected president. But now the thought occurs to me that I could win this thing. So I go to the auditorium and I look at the trophies, and the trophy for this event was almost as tall as I was. And in my mind I begin to get this picture that I'm riding in the mayor's Cadillac down Washington Avenue, Miami Beach. They're throwing confetti at me. I've got this big trophy. They're snapping pictures. A regular MacArthur comes home. Okay? The next round I go into is a semifinal round. There's no crowd, just 5 judges. And this is it. I can't fool myself that I'm doing this for Kennedy anymore. This is Frank Natter on the line. They're evaluating me personally. I got through my presidential oath and my mind went blank. Forgot the whole rest of the speech. I tried ad-libbing, but it was a lost cause. The judges put down their pencils. I knew it was over. It was humiliating. But I learned the truth of something that I would understand later with the type indicator and the Jungian personality theory. We introverts will learn to extrovert not because it's good for us, but only in service of something beyond ourselves, some person that we admire, that we're in service to, or some ideal that we believe in. For that reason, we'll learn to extrovert, but not because the teachers or parents or anyone else says, learn to do this, it's good for you. And that's important. And we extroverts can be very good speakers. Introverts rather can be very good speakers when we learn how to do it. Most of the real great actors and actresses, if you stop to think of it, are and have been introverts. We introverts have a unique ability to perform and watch ourselves performing at the same time. It's what the Russian dramatist Stanislavski, who wrote the book An Actor Prepares, which is sort of the Bible of method acting. Stanislavski talked about the importance of having the critical eye, that a good actor or actress doesn't lose themselves in their part, but can perform their part and watch themselves doing it so they could fine-tune their performance. We introverts do that naturally. In my speech classes, the extroverts report less experience with that. That doesn't sound as familiar to them as it does with the introverts. Extroverts seem to have an easier time losing themselves in the speech or getting involved with the group that they're in. They don't seem to stand apart as much and watch themselves doing whatever they're doing. So for that reason, introverts can bring an intensity to public speaking and an intensity to the stage. And they can be other people on the stage a little bit easier. You take an actor like Ronald Reagan, for instance, a typical extroverted actor. Ronald Reagan is Ronald Reagan, whether he's giving a speech at the White House, talking to Nancy, or doing bedtime for Bonzo. Same Ronald Reagan. He can do it all in the same voice, same gesture, same facial expression. He is whoever he is, wherever he is. Extroverts in the theater can change easier, can become different people, because of their ability to detach from what's going on and to watch from that detached position. Extroverts can do that too, but it's a little bit more difficult for them. Now some extroverts tell me, well, Frank, you know, there are times when I like to be alone. It's really great to be alone. And it's important that I mention to extroverts is that that's true. You see, the inner life of the introvert is like a busy city with traffic and smokestacks and buildings all over the place, because we've developed that inner world. The extrovert inner world is like an open field with daisies and butterflies and wildflowers and clear blue sky and birds. It's a beautiful place to be. And whenever the extrovert can force themselves to really get out of the world and be alone with themselves, it's terrific. Sometimes I don't even want to come back, it's so good. But it's a rubber band effect. They wind up coming back anyway. And usually they put off the next time they go back to that world. I like to suggest to extroverts that they do it more often on a regular basis, because it relieves the pressure of daily life if you have that rest of retreating sometimes to the inner world. What else do we know about extroverts and introverts? We know that extroverts marry and introverts get married. Extroverts, the seekers. The introverts wait to be found. And usually we introverts, as we were growing up, sat back and waited for somebody to find us. Then we choose from among those people who find us. That often leaves us with what we can get rather than what we want. So it's important for introverts to understand that about themselves, and you can do something about it. You can make a determined effort to be the seeker. And don't feel bad if it feels funny or it feels difficult or uncomfortable. It should, because you're an introvert. You're doing something in your shadow side. But you can do it if you want to do it. And it is important to develop the abilities to extrovert. Some people say to me, I used to be an introvert, I became an extrovert. Or I used to be an extrovert and I became an introvert. Nobody becomes. You are, according to Jung, when you're born. A better way to say it in Jungian terms is that you used to behave in pretty much of an introverted way, but then you learned how to use your extroverted side. Or you used to behave like an extrovert, but you then learned to use your introverted side to a greater degree. Now what happens if you, as you're growing up, you prefer introversion, but your parents keep throwing you with people? No good for you to be alone. Only crazy people are alone. Stop reading books. You read too much. You're going to go blind. Why don't you go to a party? Why don't you make some friends? Why don't you join a club? And there are parents who'll do that to their extroverted children. It's not a good idea. Because what with the introverted children, by the way, rather, what it tells the introverted child is that I'm not good. Or conversely, you have the introverted parents and the extroverted child. And the child will be running around, the parents will be saying, shut up, sit down, why don't you read a book? They'll be giving the kid books. And the child wants to invite friends over, they say, not now, it'll mess up the house, or not now, I've got a headache, or not now, I can't stand the confusion. These are things that introverted parents will tell their extroverted kids. And again, that tells the child it's not good to be what you prefer. So what does the child do? The child, to please the parent or to please the teacher or whomever, begins to behave in the manner that's expected. And at that point, they falsify type. They behave not their natural way, but the way they believe their people in their environment want them to be. And at first, they're a rebel. They understand what's going on. So they can be what Mommy wants me to be when Mommy's watching, what I want to be when I'm alone. But that gets confusing after a while. And so the child begins to be more and more of what's accepted. And after a few years, they forget the reason why they're doing that. And this often leads in the teen years, in the 20s, to an identity crisis. And the person says, I don't know who I really am. Well, if you had been allowed, Jung says, to grow up and follow your natural inclination, you'll grow just like a tree toward the sun, healthy, productive, and effective and happy. If, on the other hand, the sun is blocked off from you and you're forced to grow towards somebody else's universe, then you become like a tree that's been mutated or forced to grow in an ugly, unnatural way. And that becomes the appearance of a person's personality. How do you know, you might say? How do I know if I'm a real introvert or if I'm just pretending to be? How do I know if I'm a real extrovert or I'm just pretending to be? The way you can tell this in somebody is whether or not they're really happy with the preference. If you see somebody behaving in an extroverted way, but something doesn't seem right about it, it seems really phony, and you're almost embarrassed for that person, you feel like they're making a jerk out of themselves and they don't know it, there's a good chance that this person is an introvert who experienced some trauma in their inner life. Something happened that's very embarrassing. To escape from the trauma of their inner life, they escaped into their shadow extroversion. They're showing that to the world so they don't have to face their own inner world. The way you tell is that the function looks unnatural. On the other hand, the introvert who's running away, the one who's behaving like an introvert, but who's crying, who seems to be sad all the time and uncomfortable, who seems to be unhappy in their aloneness, may very well be an extrovert who experienced some embarrassment in the outer world, and they feel like they can't face people anymore. So they've retreated to their shadow side, and they're showing the world that opposite so that they don't have to deal with the shock, trauma, or embarrassment they felt in their extroverted outer life. These are ways that you can tell, and the best way to help someone is to try to encourage them to be what they naturally prefer. Isabel Meyer's strong belief was that we have no right to determine what a person's type preference is. God does that. Now, if somebody takes the type indicator, like some people, everybody in here has done, and you come out extrovert, but you say, I know I'm an introvert, then her advice is throw that indicator in the waste can. That's why she called it an indicator and not a test, because it's just a weather vane, just points in a direction. But no paper and pencil test can tell us who we are, she said. Only we can know that in our own hearts. What the indicator does is helps us ask some questions of ourselves that sort of points us in a direction. It also gives us a language we can use. And the people listening to this presentation now have a language for dealing with people who are outgoing and people who are inner-directed, who are quiet. And hopefully people will see these as two natural and proper ways to be. Hopefully people will realize that it's okay to be introvert, but that in the United States today, being an introvert is not popular. Being an extrovert is popular. The person who is seen as successful and happy is the one who has a lot of friends, belongs to a lot of clubs, knows everybody in the neighborhood. The general outgoing person. The people who are quiet are suspect. People think there's something wrong with them. The quiet ones you've got to watch, and all these kinds of expressions that come out to put a tag on introvert behaving people as if somehow they're less good than extrovert people. And this can affect us in a relationship, and that's the last point I'd like to share with you today is how this can affect us in a relationship, and perhaps describing a relationship where this happened. In my own parents, for instance, my mother was extrovert and my father was introvert. I wish I knew this information when I was a kid. Maybe I could have been of some use, as it were, but extroverts have a need for people. And this need for people is almost as great as their need for food or their need for warmth. And when they're denied people, they begin to feel cold and empty and hollow and depressed. Introverts, on the other hand, have a need for everything to be together in their own small, compact space. So my mother, in this case, liked to go out dancing. That was her way of getting her extrovert's needs taken care of. My father thought a perfect evening at home was to sit in the bedroom where he had his radios and TV hookups, and he liked to play with the cathode tubes of those days and so forth, and with my mother sitting quietly beside him reading a book or knitting. That was his idea of the perfect wife. And so they'd argue. She'd say, how could he stand to sit in that room all the time? He was a deadhead, a bore, and so forth, and that she was going out. He would get upset with her and yell at her. Where was she going? She had somebody else out there. He knew that she was seeing somebody else. And How could she stand to go out? She's a mother of children, and just go out like that in the street without her husband and so forth. Well, she took that as long as she could, and then she went out. And she came back late, and the argument would start again. How do we stop an argument like that? We stop it by understanding that it's okay to be introvert, it's okay to be extrovert. If she could have said to him, look, I understand you need to be alone, there's nothing wrong with that. I understand you like to have me here while you're alone, there's nothing wrong with that either. But that's not what I like. So I'll make a deal with you. I'll be with you some of the time the way you need to be, you be with me some of the time the way I need to be. And I won't put you down for what you are, and you don't put me down for what I am, because neither one of us is right, and neither one of us is wrong. With Jung's message to Freud. We're just different. And differences can be good. And as Jung said, we actually seek out our differences. We extroverts seek out introverts to give depth to our lives, purpose. And introverts seek out extroverts to deal with the outer world, to take care of the parties and sending the cards on people's anniversaries and birthdays and so forth. We're mutually useful to one another if we understand the differences and that those differences are good.